invite our session chairperson, Shri Shiva Rajaraman, CEO, NIIF Infrastructure Finance Limited, to share his valuable insights with us during the session. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Shri Shiva Rajaraman.
Let me start by giving a very quick brief of what is NIIF. Of course, he mentioned it in a little more detail. This is not to market my organization. My organization does not need marketing. Put it that way. NIIF was created by Shri Arun Jaitley in his budget speech as India's first sovereign wealth fund. So the thought process was that similar organizations have been created in the past, maybe not called a sovereign fund, but created in the past and did not succeed. What were the reasons for those? One thought process was very simple, that management should be largely with private sector, and money should come from multiple sources, not one source. These were the three principles. So NIIF is largely a public-private partnership. 49% at the top level. Equity is given by the government of India. 51% comes mostly from international funds, almost all of them in the private domain. The management is entirely private. The staff is entirely private. On my board, I do not have a single government member as a nominee on the board. Not that it is wrong to have one, but as we heard a little earlier, communication matters. Perception matters sometimes even more than reality. Elections are won and elections are lost on perception, not always on reality. So therefore, the thought process was freedom of management should be given to this institution. Therefore, the management will be in the private sector. You can see even in the banking space, the P by B or price to book valuations of all public sector banks are low and of several private sector banks are high. Why? It is the perception of free decision-making ability and quick decision-making ability. So NIIF has 3 equity funds, around $4.5 billion roughly funding has happened, and 2 lending entities, debt fund, through which again $4.5 billion of funding has happened. Almost all of it is directly into the infrastructure space as defined by the Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India's harmonized list. So this is a backgrounder on what NIIF has done. Many of the investors include Canada Pension Plan, Australian Super. It also includes large Indian entities. For example, Infosys Employees Provident Fund, Wipro Employees Provident Fund. The Indian Army has several funds. One of the funds of the Army has invested, so on and so forth. This is just to give you a background. Now, what do? We fund infrastructure in various manners. Investment equity, sometimes early stage, sometimes late stage, through the equity fund. And lending, of course, there is one separate entity which funds projects under construction. There is another separate entity which funds projects which are operational, refinances other lenders in order to save them of their asset liability mismatch issues. Now, the important thing here is that in our lending portfolio, we have 0 NPA since inception. The entire 40-odd thousand crore which has gone into financing is 0 NPA from inception. And it's a term used in banking circles, 0 DPD, not even a single days of delay. Now, how has this happened? Is it because we are funding only AAA rated institutions? The answer is no. ILFS was a AAA rated institution. So AAA does not mean they will never default. But we have not funded AAA rated institutions. We mostly funded in the BBB range, right? And none of them have defaulted. So there must be something that we have done right. Okay. So now let me go to, this is just as an introduction. Let me go to a few other points. On communication, I think she had mentioned on communication. There are many schemes introduced by the government, various governments, state, central, provincial, etc. At the time at which they are introduced, often the utility of that is not understood properly. For example, Prime Minister Vajpayee spoke of interlinking of rivers. Now, this was already done between the Tamil Nadu government and the Andhra Pradesh government 15 years before he spoke about it. Krishna River was brought to Tamil Nadu, and integrated with another water source to meet Chennai's resource. The noon meal scheme was introduced in several states, including Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, etc., where the benefit would come to the next generation. In other words, the politicians who introduced it were not thinking of their votes because they would not survive by the time the benefits of this came to the next generation. So, India that way does not really need to copy from other countries. Many models have succeeded here. There are some which have failed also. It is not that they've not. But unless you try, how do you know whether it will succeed or not? Earlier, some of the mistakes were made because the government used to take a decision first, go ahead, and then take feedback. Now, that loop was the wrong order in which to do things. I'm very happy to note that here the order in which things are done is that a pilot is done, feedback sessions like these are done upfront so that feedback is obtained from various types of participants. And in a sense, this is also fallout of the PPP model, which has been there for a number of years. You want the private sector to invest, you need to take their views. You don't have to listen to everything that they say. As an example, if on my hand as a lender, if I look at it, what does every borrower want? 0% interest rate, no security, and indefinite period funds. So that cannot be possible. So every stakeholder has a requirement, and there needs to be a balancing of these requirements, right? In such a way that everybody's interest is taken care of and that the entire structure works. Very happy to see that the pilot project launches are looking at financial viability, technical viability, system viability, and the point of local is very important. We can copy from Germany, we can copy from Sweden, but are the circumstances in India the same? They are clearly not. We can look at the examples. Of course, we should not stop looking. Definitely, we should look in terms of case studies. But the circumstances in India, as he rightly mentioned, are extremely different. Now, can you have a system whereby every truck and every car connects to the grid as they are traveling along a highway? India's requirement is very different. Therefore, possibly that may not be the right solution for India. Right? Now, just what does a financier look for? Where does the money come from is a very important aspect. We look for business models that are tested and tried. Right? So the pilot is very important for us to know whether if something succeeds in a small way, it can be scaled up 10 times, 15 times, 20 times. And I think our Prime Minister is looking at scaling up things maybe 1 lakh times in many areas. And that is important for cost to go down, for cost to drive. What happened in solar? There was a thought process that solar would never compete with coal-based power. 15 rupees per unit, I remember 2010, 2011, the Gujarat PPAs. At that time, government had to subsidize, government had to bring in models. Feed-in tariffs was what we called it. Today, the government supported for some years. After that, it transitioned to a market-based tariff. And today, the market-based tariff are 2 rupee, 3 rupee, 3 rupee 50, so on and so forth. Right? So this transition is important. This support from the government in initial stages is important. But if the pilot is able to do it without any subsidy, we are going one step further. One step further. It makes sense from a commercial point of view. It makes sense from a system point of view, and it makes sense in this. What is the government's role? Earlier, the government's role was to provide infrastructure to its citizens. 10, 15 years back, that concept changed to government will ensure that infrastructure is provided, but they need not provide it themselves. Now, that actually came out of a necessity that the government did not have the money. Fiscal deficits were high, and you had to bring in public-private partnerships. Today, we can be proud of the kind of highways we have. And all of you are old enough to know that 20 years back, 25 years back, we did not have these. And people would look toward Germany, people would look to, by the way, the German highways, the Autobahns, where the best roads in the world, they were built by slave labor, by Adolf Hitler and his government, by getting slaves from Russia, etc., to make it, not probably the ideal way of making it. Naturally, if you make a road with slave labor, you don't have to pay for it. Therefore, it does not become costly. We have not done it that way. We have done it the right way. Yes, there were some course corrections to be done in the middle, but whenever you start anything new, there are course corrections to be done. So, initial BOT toll annuity model took off a little. The next year's refinancing will be to the range of 1 lakh crore. Next year alone will come up for refinancing to the range of 1 lakh crore. So it has been a success. Now, coming back to what does a lender look for? Tried and tested business model or a stable business model. In this case, it is a new business model. So it will not be like 10-year stability or something. Tried and tested is important. Good counterparties. Long-term contracts are something we look for in project finance. This model is a little different. In fact, it does not say PPP, it's actually PPPP. People part is also brought in. People, public, private sector, and partnership. So there are 4 Ps here actually. It's more innovative than what has been there in the past. Second, in terms of a concept, we are used to looking at one owner. So here you're looking at owners of charging the batteries as well as the owner of vehicle, 2 different segments. How to align their interests, either contractually or otherwise, will be important, because in India, not everything goes based on the contract. Ultimately, it goes on the basis of, does it make economic sense to the parties? You will find wherever contracts are broken, either by the government or by the private party, it is because it is at some point not making economical sense. Why did the Andhra Pradesh government break the power purchase agreements for a period till Supreme Court forced them to go back to honoring the commitment? Simply because at that time it did not make economic sense to them. Stable business models, good counterparties, long-term contracts, fairly long-term projections, and a view on break-even, as he mentioned, but not just break-even, a view on getting returns on your investment, which are proportional to the risk which has been assessed. That is also important, both from an equity point of view as well as from a debt point of view. Risk assessment does not mean there is no risk. There will be risk. Crossing a highway in, I don't know, Delhi has a risk, right? There will be a risk. How do you mitigate it? You go up the staircase and go on the other side, or you cross the road when there is no traffic. These are 2 ways of mitigation. So you mitigate or allocate or absorb. He was talking about, I think, lightning strikes impacting the kind of infrastructure which Germany is putting up. In our business, in my company, for example, the executives who fund infrastructure, you will hear the word DSCR as often as you hear the word lightning arrestor. So we are using lightning arrestor for our solar projects. It helps divert the lightning away towards, what is a lightning arrestor? It's no great thing. The concept is the same as why you do earthing or why you wear rubber slippers when there is some risk of leakage of power. It's the same reason. So that mitigation, allocation, and absorption. What is allocation? You allocate the risk to a different party. For example, to an insurer, if he's willing to insure that at the right price. Right? So these are things we look for. Here there is, of course, we mentioned a chicken and egg situation. I think it's been mentioned quite a few occasions on quite a few places, that if you don't have enough vehicles, then why would anybody put infrastructure for it? And if you don't have enough infrastructure, why would the vehicles be purchased? So therefore, there is a need to align both at the same time, which is what I think the effort is. In our view, as I wear 2 hats, as I said. One part I don't wear, my institution wears 2 hats. One part is that of an equity investor. The other part is that of a debt investor. Both have different interests. In both cases, this point is very important. The pilot project is important. The getting the feedback is important. Structuring it properly is important if you want long-term benefit out of it. And fourth, every stakeholder's requirement, the chicken and egg situation can also be mitigated if both come together. I think it's proceeding, in my view at least, in the right direction. There are a few more points which I wanted to mention. Some of these, see, we look at which comes first. We look at market risk, financial risk, technology risk, regulatory risk, construction risk, operation risk, security risk, etc. A typical checklist of what a lender looks for. In that, actually, the market and technology come first. Because we are in the business, for example, of giving 22-year loan. We source our money from pension funds and provide it for very, very long periods. Now, technology risk, if there is a risk that the technology is going to drastically change in 5 or 6 years, then a 20-year financing becomes a little difficult. Happy to note that what we are looking for in this particular business model is, if I'm not mistaken, 3 to 4 year break even. 36 months is what you mentioned. 36 to 40 months break even. Now, typically, from the lender's hat, a borrower or an investor or a developer gives a business model. We tend to moderate it a bit. So 4 साल 5 साल हुआ तो भी, I think it should be a model that bankers, lenders, and institutions which are into mezzanine kind of financing can work with. Now, I'm not talking out of the top of my hat. My institution has funded $100 million for Athar Energy, for example, last year, and 3 or 4 other proposals are pending in the EV space. There are a few points which, of course, from the lending side, we have not funded it for a simple reason that it is not coming under RBI and Government of India's harmonized definition of infrastructure. We are not allowed to go outside the definition. We have spoken to the government. Government has created a committee to expand the definition, harmonized definition of infrastructure. And I'm sure this area will get included in the next 3 months. But I'm only mentioning it because we have not funded this area, though we have examined it in a fair amount of detail. We have also done our own calculations. I think in the previous session, there was a question. ये सब इतने highways में करेंगे, तो power requirement कितना होगा? There is an assessment that we have made, both in terms of demand and supply, because if the supply does not come to that extent and the demand is there, naturally the price of power, there will be an impact on the price of power. But there, I think the previous session, the speaker had given, from IHMCL, had given a solution with respect to how solar energy localized can provide the power for the charging stations and charging areas. I think it makes sense commercially and from the point of view of an investor and a banker. Now, the other point I wanted to make, I think in the business plan, as I have understood it, I have a lot of questions which we will be writing to you on. What I have understood from what he has told me and what is there in the material over here, 30% utilization is sufficient for a payback of 36 to 40 months is the understanding. We will, of course, business does not run on Excel. Excel is the first point of business. We will also test it in our business models. We naturally do sensitivities. We will be seeing what happens, what if analysis, etc. Those are things we will consult with you and do. But I think 30% by and large, from an intuitive point of view, sounds reasonable. I would say 40-45% is what we have observed in other businesses, which are not an exact parallel, but somewhat similar businesses. But I take your point. I mean, we will examine this, of course. Also, the point where I think the person gets cash, the 30% of the cash comes, at the time at which he has to start paying EMIs. Is that my understanding is correct? Yes, yes, at the handover. That also intuitively makes sense. I think it will make sense to the individual concerned also. Now, I'm not getting into exact whether it should be 30% or 40, but because those will change, I guess, over a period of time as the business model gets improved also. Even just a week back, there was a session, and this same minister had also come. Now, in that session, we were discussing green hydrogen, how to popularize green hydrogen in India when it costs 3 times more or 3.5 times more than the hydrogen which is today used, popularly known as, within quotes, gray hydrogen. How can we do it? There are many methods which have come out as a process. For example, just as you are doing ethanol blending, can you blend 5% of green hydrogen or 10% mandatorily with gray hydrogen? That's one thought process. Just as in the solar model, SECI was created as an aggregator, is there a possibility of a requirement that the government can create an aggregator? We should also note that any suggestions which either come from the private sector or from the public sector for that matter should not be too heavy on the government in terms of allocations, because the government has many priorities and everything cannot be a priority. There are solutions which can be done. For example, I've attended pre-budget sessions with the finance minister. 90% of the people who attend ask only for one thing: "Mera tax zero kara do." Yeah, give me so much subsidy. But that is not a sustainable long-term business model. It can be done in initial stages when the government comes in just to lead, to show the way, and to create capacities. Once you create, for example, when you create capacities for solar module production in India, the prices will fall. Now, to help that capacity creation, government's PLI scheme can help, but it cannot be a permanent scheme. Private investors cannot expect to earn returns only from the taxpayers' money. Ultimately, the business has to start generating. Initial thrust, initial push is okay and important. In this particular case, I don't think they're asking for the moon from the government. So I think that from a perspective from our side also seems to make sense. So without taking too much more time, the cost per kilometer, we would also like to examine the numbers, not that we distrust you or something, but as a prudent investor slash lender, we'd like to examine the numbers, because sometimes, the life cycle costs are not are different from the initial cost. It's a simple point. You can buy an AC that costs less today. Our experience and our comments in various areas, we are not experts in the EV area, but we are experts in investment and financing, and we are created for that reason. So thank you very much for having invited.